going. We are live. Okay. I'll start with my introduction. Hello, my name is Kimberly Chambers, and I am a poetry student with the University of Pennsylvania. And I am joined by my husband Tim and friends Anna and Jordan. During our time together, we will be collaborating on a close reading and discussion of the poem I Dwell in Possibility by Emily Dickinson. A close reading provides an opportunity for problem solving as we carefully examine and work through trying to understand the meaning behind the poem. What is Dickinson pointing to? Dickinson was a prolific poet during the Romantic era, having written over 1,800 poems, many of which were never published while she was alive. We will explore her strong use of metaphors and nature. Thank you for your participation today, and I look forward to what we discover together. Okay, let's go ahead, and I will go ahead and read the poem, I Dwell in Possibility. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. Okay, let's start off with Anna. Anna, what do you think of when you consider the word dwell?
I consider a resting place or a place of residency, somewhere where you are existing for maybe more permanency than just visitation.
Right, okay. Could it have any other meanings?
I've seen it used in when you're setting the timing on a car, the timing, and you have a strobe light, and when the timing belt, the engine is set on a certain frequency, it's like boom, boom, boom. So it's kind of like you dwell on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other ideas of dwell?
No.
Have you been dwelling on your scores for your LSAT?
Yeah. I guess to piggyback off of what Anna said, in the sense that it's a habitation of an area, it can also mean being consumed by something, not just dwelling in a physical location, but dwelling on some incorporeal idea.
Right. Okay, those are excellent, really excellent
And
answers.
that actually reminds me of a scripture that said, dwell on these things. Like George was saying, dwelling on something as opposed to into something. Yeah.
Right. So as we keep in mind about Dickinson and her use of metaphors, she's often packing a lot into a very small line. The word has a lot of power to it, okay? Jordan, tell me what you think of when you think of possibility. And why is the word possibility capitalized? Why do you think that?
So whenever I think of possibility, I think of almost the opposite of definition, something that is unset, like the idea of crossroads, like it invokes fate, that there's so many different opportunities in front of you. You haven't defined the one that will come yet. And I think it's capitalized maybe to emphasize sort of a like anthropomorphic, like that it's not just, chance or opportunity, but that there's some sort of consciousness to possibility, like that possibility is an entity.
Right.
Maybe even like significance and importance to it.
Right. So kind of the opposite of probability, would you say?
I think so, yeah. Like probability is saying this thing will happen and, here's the level of how certain we are that it'll happen, versus possibility is just the doors are open. There's a million different opportunities here.
Yeah, that's really good. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Tim? Anna?
I mean,
go ahead.
I was just going to say possibility is like the likelihood of anything happening, whether tangible or intangible. So she could be using that for a range of meanings in terms of what is possible, and then almost dwelling back to that word, dwelling in possibility, meaning she could be dwelling in really a range of things.
Exactly. Okay. Well, so it's like me saying it's possible that I could run a marathon, but not likely. There's a possibility in my future. I'd like to do it, but it is a long shot. And the probability of getting me up and going to a staff meeting in the morning is very probable, right? So the meaning possible with a capital P gives a positive openness. And this is where Dickinson's mind dwells, which is what you're touching on as well. Tim, tell us about Fairer House Than Prose. Why does Dickinson create a metaphor of a house when she's dwelling in possibility in her mind?
Well, I was looking at those two lines, and I was thinking more in terms of contrast. Like, what would be the opposite of prose? It would, it'd be poetry. So I wonder if, I dwell in poetry or a fairer house than prose. So whatever the first line is, I dwell in possibility. Whatever that is a comparison to the house of prose.
Mm-hmm.
So the house, because she said I dwell in, so I'm thinking I dwell not on, but I dwell in the house of possibility, a fairer house than the house of prose. So that was one thought that came to mind. So I'm wondering, the opposite of prose would be like poetry, and since she's writing a poem. The other thing I was thinking is when I read it quietly, silently, I read it just as a bunch of words, but then when all of a sudden I read it out loud, it seemed to have a kind of a cadence to it. And it was like, wow, that's actually very pretty. That's
those
why
are
I'm
really
wondering
good.
the poetry thing.
That's a really good point. We're going to just stop right there for a second, and we're going to go to this page that I provided and quickly just go through the differences between poetry and prose as we continue kind of dissecting this poem. So nearly all writing shares the goal of communicating a message to an audience, but how that message is communicated can differ greatly. The divisions between poetry and prose aren't clear-cut, but here are some generally accepted differences. Prose, our most everyday writing, is in prose form. The language of prose is typically straightforward without much decoration. Ideas are contained in sentences that are arranged in paragraphs. There are no line breaks. Sentences run to the right margin. The first word of each sentence is capitalized, and prose looks like large blocks of words. Conversely, poetry is typically reserved for expressing something special in an artistic way. The language of poetry tends to be more expressive or decorated with comparisons, rhyme, and rhythm, and contributing to a different sound and feel. Ideas are contained in lines that may or may not be sentences. Lines are arranged in stanzas. Poetry uses line breaks for various reasons, to follow a formatted rhythm or to emphasize an idea. Lines can run extremely long or be as short as one word or one letter. Keep that in mind as we progress. Traditionally, the first letter of every line is capitalized, but many modern poets choose not to follow this rule strictly. The shape of poetry can vary depending on line length and the intent of the poet. So, as we continue to consider this house of prose, we're going to come back to that. What do you think fairer means? Anyone?
In the second line?
Yes, exactly.
I think, and this is piggybacking off of what you said about maybe possibility representing poetry here, and then fairer house than prose. Fairer, and then also taking into consideration the differences between prose and poetry, almost her maybe emphasizing that she feels there is more expression, more breadth that she can emphasize through poetry than she can through prose, and so she's emphasizing that if she's dwelling in possibility, dwelling in poetry, it is far fairer than prose for her. She can convey much more.
Okay. Well, when you think of the actual word fair, what do you think of?
I think, well, whenever I think of the word fair, and I think also how she's using it here is closely correlated to beauty, that as opposed to the functionality of the house
Right.
The house that she's living in, the possibility house, the poetic house, is much more beautiful than the house of prose, which I think contains that expressiveness.
Okay.
But that the house that she's in, and I don't want to skip ahead of you, but that it's
no, it's okay.
she goes on to describe like how breathtaking it is. She says it's impregnable to, you can't even take it in visually. And so that then helps to qualify my idea of her use of fairer here, that it's a visual thing, it's an aesthetic, it's an experiential thing. It's not necessarily, oh, this house is great because there's a roof and I don't get cold in this house. It's, no, this house is so fair, it's so, you sit in this house and you experience what's going on, and it's beautiful.
Okay, that's really good. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
When was it written?
1863 maybe.
Yeah. So the reason I ask is I'm thinking fairer is used different than, it was used in terms of, like Jordan said, in
Right.
terms of beauty.
Right.
What Cinderella, who is the fairest
Of all the land, that's what I thought of. Who's the fairest of all the land?
Yes, exactly. Now she does use the word fairest in the third stanza, so we'll see how that plays out a little bit more as we continue discussing. More numerous of windows. So thinking back to the time that she lived, what do you think that means? More numerous of windows. Was it the wealthy or the more poor that could, have more windows in their houses?
Definitely the wealthy, because when you think of more windows, you think of a larger house.
Sure.
Because the smaller the house, likely not going to have as many windows.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, probably more heat.
Right. And then superior for doors. Like,
bigger.
What kind of a door? She's got a pretty superior door on this house. Okay. So you're getting the feeling that this is a pretty grand house that she's describing here. But she's not, when she talks about the fairer house than prose, she's not talking about a house that is like better than an apartment. It is not physical. It is completely metaphorical, okay? And as Tim had mentioned earlier, the opposite to prose is poetry. And what makes this poem a poem is because of its ambiguity, the dashes, the capitalization in different parts of the poem, the verse. So she's saying something that she's not really doing, okay? The possibility is to impossibility as poetry is to prose, okay? You see how she's like, it's interesting how she plays those words like that. She's referring to limits and restrictions in linguistic conventions, okay? And so as we go back to the windows, let's talk about those windows for a second. What do you think the windows could be a metaphor for?
I would see opportunity, and also, I'm an artist, so for me, looking out the windows is inspiring, like taking in and responding to, as opposed to being closed in without, the vision to see further. But also, it seems if we're talking, if she puts poetry and possibility as interchanging metaphor, words, I wonder if possibility is a potential, so it can't be contained. That's just my thought.
I almost think when I think of windows, I'm thinking like windows, like eyes are the windows to the soul, and so I think of perspective when I'm hearing windows, and I'm seeing like if we're using the house metaphor still, and we're picturing with her this metaphor of a house, and we look in and there's various windows, well, the windows on the east side are going to look different than the windows on the west side because of the light depiction, and that's true of painting too, right? Where you're like light fixtures coming from, and so I think of a perspective.
Yeah, that's really good. That's an idea I had not heard even in the video that I had watched with a bunch of TAs and
Wow.
this guy. They did not talk about the East and the West and the North and the South.
Right.
But that's a really good point. I'm going to write that down.
Yeah.
So it is many different viewpoints and,
Right.
and different perspectives.
For sure.
And light comes in. It comes in. So why so many windows when you have this superior door? Why do you think that is? What is it suggesting?
I have an idea. Just
Yeah.
you know, in comparing prose with poetry. With prose, I have to get from A to B. I have to have. There has to be a storyline, and it can't be ambiguous. It has to make sense. And I think with poetry, there's more room, more windows, more doors to explore.
Right.
Yeah.
Try to say
Right.
something that doesn't quite fit into a sentence, but saying
Right.
it's kind of like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. The era that followed Romanticism was Imagism,
Yeah.
and they wanted to get to the point. Like, spell it out, tell me what it is,
Yep.
and don't make me dig for this.
Yeah.
The Romantics were like, you're going to dig for this, you're going
Right.
to work for this.
Right.
Which is really, to me, a lot more fun because it feels like you're digging for jewels, as opposed to like being right in my face. There's obviously pros in both sides of it. So with Emily Dickinson, this door metaphorically states that she's pretty exclusive about who comes into her house. She is. She's basically got a, what would you call it?
Exclusivity.
She definitely has an exclusivity, but she's going to make you pay for it. She's going to have a charge for how you get into this house, and we're gonna continue.
Almost like a standard.
A toll.
Yeah, exactly. So, moving on, of House of Chambers, which is an interesting way to say that sentence. What are the chambers? What is that speaking of?
Rooms, right?
Rooms.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Rooms in the house. This might suggest the bedroom. Where would you put cedar in a house? When you think of cedar. Now, I don't know, are you guys familiar with cedar? And like, did your grandmother use cedar? Like, oh, honey, keep those moths out of the closet. Hang your cedar up.
Yeah, I
Or
mean,
she
like,
may have had a cedar chest.
Yeah.
yeah, I think of a chest.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of cedar. I don't care for the way it smells.
Yeah, I
But-
do recognize cedar smell, so I
Yes.
thought of the smell in the chest.
Right.
When you open that chest, you get the
Right.
cedar smell.
But it's generally in that bedroom because you're trying to keep the moths away, correct? And this, during that time, was another indication of this is a pretty fancy house. Okay. The actual cedar tree is the tallest tree in Lebanon.
Yeah.
So the closet or the bedroom could be an indication of the bedroom being the tallest room in the house. And we will continue to build upon that, being the tallest, okay? And I will just say that Dickinson, later in her life, she was kind of known as a recluse. And she never left her bedroom for
Right.
days on end, writing her poetry. That, you know, that's where she loved to live, was in that room in her mind. Jordan, you touched on Impregnable of I. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, so it is. I read that line as qualifying, building off of the line prior to it about the chambers.
Okay.
And so I didn't even make the connection of cedar as, you know, like the smell, the function, the utility of it. Whenever I first read cedar, I thought of King Solomon, who said, if we're going to build this temple, we have to use cedar wood because it's the only wood that's big enough. It's the only thing we could use to accommodate this massive structure that we're about to build. And so with that in my head, that cedar it's what you have to use for building big structures because it's the tallest tree.
Yes.
It makes the tallest plank. So it's impregnable of I. impregnable meaning it can't be conquered, it can't be overcome. Your eye cannot fully realize whatever it is. It's so large that you just have to keep looking up and up and up, and your eye will never overtake the structure that you're viewing.
Yeah, those are some really good points. I'm gonna write that down too.
Yeah, you mentioned relegating the cedar to the closet and everything for its aromatic characteristics and moth repelling characteristics. But when I see this in context for me, of Chambers as the cedars, impregnable, I forget how to say the word, and but in the same thing, and for an everlasting roof, the gambols of the sky. I see not there's a closet with the cedar, but the walls, the structure is strong. The cedar is also, it's very strong, and it does resist rot and bugs and everything like that. But she's talking walls and roofs. She didn't say the cedar and the closet rods or anything. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it, as this strong, sturdy, mighty structure, something that can stand the test of time.
Yeah, that's really good.
So I'm thinking, if she's talking poetry, maybe there is more of an eternal nature to poetry compared to prose, where sometimes you can read prose from 100 years ago or 200 years ago or something like that, and you're like, it's a little bit more antiquated for me, where poetry seems to be a little bit more timeless.
That's a really good point too. Really good point. It does. I did a lot of research on Emily Dickinson, and I wish I had actually written down this quote that she said, but there was a point in her life where she basically had a religious experience, and she talked about how something to the effect of knowing her Savior meant more to her than anything. And she knew the Bible inside and out. And so the very fact that she used the cedars and thinking of Lebanon, I was like, oh, there must have been some kind of a spiritual influence that was going on there that maybe to the person who doesn't dwell in possibilities may have missed that completely, So it's an interesting thought for sure.
I think as I'm like reading the line of impregnable of I, and then for an everlasting roof, not to get ahead of us, but she's using these like very definitive words, and I think piggybacking off of the very first stanza, she's further emphasizing, I feel like throughout the entire poem, this grandiose. Not only just this house, yes, this poetry, but it's almost like the grandiose of it all. And I feel like those definitives of like impregnable, everlasting, like those are just her further emphasizing the grandiose of it.
Yeah, right. And you're definitely getting down that path that she is trying to lead us in. So I mentioned earlier that there is a price of admission to enter Dickinson's house and see the rooms, okay? What is that cost of admission? Well, you're not going to pass until you show me what it takes to enter. The fee is dwelling in possibility, using your imagination. Don't be a limited bore, okay? The House of Poetry has a lot of windows, a door, a very tall, bedroom walls that you cannot really see in, and the sky is the roof. So even though you have all these windows, you can't really see in, and she's not letting you in unless you pay the price of admission. But if you wanted to climb the house, you could look in through the roof. But again, it's a metaphor. So moving into this, when we look at the everlasting, for an everlasting roof. So what would you guys say? Your parents were in construction. How long would you say a roof lasts? When does it need to be replaced? Generally.
Oh, well, today, 10, 15, 20 years.
That's excellent. A previous student said a couple centuries.
No.
No.
And I thought, no, babe, that's definitely not.
You've gone through a couple roofs at that point. You've gone through a couple.
Right, exactly. So it's not necessarily meant to last. I mean, they are meant to be replaced, okay? Now, our roof is a tin roof. I don't know, how long did our tin roof last?
150 years.
150 years, which is
Wow.
a very, very, very long time.
Wow.
But still, it still needed to be replaced,
Right.
okay? She's talking about an everlasting roof. This roof in the House of Possibilities doesn't need a roofer in 10 or 20 years because God is the roofer who provides the heavens an everlasting roof. What do you think of when you think of gambrels? What is a gambrel? No, you might know it. Let them,
Okay.
because
I know
you've
it.
built a couple houses, so you might know this answer. But when you think of the gambrels of the sky, and you're thinking of this roof, and they're meshing together, what do you think of?
I don't know what a gambrel is.
Yeah, I don't think I'm familiar, but if I had to guess, it might be something either used to fasten a beam to something,
Excellent. I would say that that's a good answer.
or it's a beam itself. I don't
It's
know.
the structure. It's the
Okay.
structure that basically is holding the
Okay.
roof. Would you want to expound on that?
It's actually not the structure,
Okay.
but it's the type of roof. There's a gable roof, which is just two flat sides going together.
Okay.
You know, just two flat. A gambrel is the barn type roof where it goes up a little bit and then it angles in together.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So it's
Okay.
kind of
Yes.
Yeah.
like, you know,
It looks
two,
more like a barn roof.
Yes.
Yes.
two angles to each side of the roof.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So
okay.
yeah, it's more
Yeah.
the barn type.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'll have to
But
let the professor.
I
know
didn't really
that's
understand
not
why
what
she put
gambrel
gambrels.
is.
I think it might have been a poetic thing, maybe even for the timing. But one thought I had about the everlasting roof was not so much for someone on the outside to see in, but to say, I'm thinking of a house that has windows that someone can peek in. But what if you had a house that was tall and the windows were higher, so you couldn't see in unless you were inside? I mean, you couldn't. The windows are usable from the inside, but not necessarily from the outside.
Oh yeah.
And here you have this structure, which I say if I'm an artist or a writer, I could say, this is my poetry, this is my means of expression, but it's limitless in terms I can see in, because the sky isn't like, wow, look at all the things up there. There's clouds in the sky, maybe a moon, stars, but I mean, obviously out here you're seeing humanity. You know, you don't see, look up there and go, oh, there's my aunt,
Right.
But
Yeah.
but there's no limitation to your expression.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
that's-
how I saw it.
Yes.
So taking in this
Yeah.
way, and I can just express.
Yeah.
That's a
Eternally.
great way. So you're saying that you're letting views and perspective and beauty come through the windows, as opposed to
Inspired this
looking
way.
out. As opposed to looking out.
Well, you're looking out to see that.
Okay.
That's where your inspiration comes in. That's where my life around me. I see the people. I see the farmlands. I see the city. Whatever it is.
Mm.
But there's no ceiling to keep me from creating. And there's,
Yeah.
I can just keep creating.
Yeah.
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 Boundlessly.
You said limitless, and that took the words right out of my mouth, because as we're dwelling in a house of possibility, you just think of the phrase, the possibilities are endless, and now we're
Yes.
talking about this roof, and it's limitless. It's
Yes.
endless.
Yes.
Isn't.
The
There's
sky's
no.
the limit.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, really good points, you guys. This
Yeah.
has been really fun. Okay. Of visitors, hashtag the fairest, hashtag. What do you see in that particular line?
The readers? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think.
Visitors be the readers of the poetry?
Well, so I think it's interesting that she capitalized the V, because we saw that she capitalized in those first two lines in the first stanza, she capitalized the P in possibility and then the H and P for house and prose.
Yeah.
And so now she's talking of visitors, and she revisits the fairest. And so she's saying almost the fairest of the visitors are those who are permitted through the door. They have to be the fairest of visitors, and that's that standard, that's that toll that they're paying.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
her requirement, her prereq.
Yeah. You nailed it. I mean, that's truly what she's doing. And quite honestly, this poem, as lovely as it is, she's a bit conceited, because she's basically saying, my standard's way up here,
Yeah.
and you may not meet it. You
Yeah.
may not pass the test because you're not the fairest.
Yeah.
And so she wants to include visitors that think with these these possibilities, these unlimited possibilities of imagination.
Yeah.
And that's why she wrote a lot of metaphors and used nature quite a bit in her poetry. How about does anyone else have anything to say about that? I don't want to rush us, but I want to.
I think I'm good with that. I'm looking forward to the next few lines here.
Yeah.
Okay, so for occupation, #this. What do you think of that?
I had an idea.
Okay, let's hear it.
So the visitors, the occupation isn't like vocation like we're thinking of. It's more like, why are you here? You know, if you're here for a concert, your occupation is to take this in. And then I was wondering, I've read this poem a number of times now, and I kept wondering, what is this there for? And now I think I see it. It said, for occupation, this.
Yeah.
And this refers to the next line, is spreading wide my narrow hands. And I thought she could have just said my hand, but I think by giving a physical attribute to the capital hand, so narrow is like, she's a woman, so maybe she had small, narrow hand. And then the hands was the creation of her poetry to gather. And I don't get to gather paradise, so you guys can illuminate me on that. But for me, it's like, okay, the visitors, you're reading this poetry, you're reading this. What is this? And this is me, that expression we talked about, creating, the sky's the limit. That's my guess.
You're definitely getting hot.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're definitely getting hot. Any other thoughts here?
Yeah, I agree. I think for occupation is it in my head. It then harkens back to the dwelling. I dwell in possibility, which we said. You can dwell on something and you can dwell in something. And if you're dwelling in something, you're occupying that something. You're embodying it. You are in it. And so whenever I'm reading it, and I agree that this, she uses these dashes as the line caps.
Yes.
But then there's a dash that is not the line cap. And in prose, if you use dashes like that, it's an insert, right?
Yes.
And so for occupation, what? This, then expecting the resolution of what is the occupation, it's the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. And I do think the narrow I think that it is really interesting because gathering paradise is like, well, that's impossible. You can't.
Yeah.
And it's by saying my narrow hands to gather paradise, she's emphasizing the paradox, the oxymoronic, these small hands to reach out and grab together this whole paradise, which is, I think, interesting because it follows on a theme almost within the poem. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house. It's a house, but the walls are the trees and the roof is the sky. It's this house that can't exist. It's huge. It's massive.
Yeah.
It is incorporeal. It's nature itself. It's the world itself. And within this oxymoronic, impossible house, I take my small little hands and I grab paradise.
I do think it's interesting that she says wide. I spreading wide my narrow hands.
Yeah.
Which I think I agree with you is like harkening back to that's really the grandiose of this house. It is unimaginable. It is impregnable of the eye.
Yeah.
And she's spreading wide her narrow hands, knowing almost that she can't fully gather capital P paradise, but that as those visitors occupy this space, this capital T, spreading wide her narrow hands to gather them in.
Yes. I love your perspective on this. It's one that I hadn't heard. And that's why I really chose this particular project, because I do love hearing the perspectives of others, because it helps widen my own perspective on things.
Yeah.
The particular professor that led this discussion, he talked about occupation.
Before are you going to give the answer?
Yes.
I have one thought that came to mind
Okay,
after
sure.
listening to Anna and
Sure.
Jordan. Remember I told you I had no idea what to gather paradise, how that fit in. But then, after listening to you two, this came to mind. One was this occupation. So you have the visitors now. So you have this house of poetry.
Yeah.
And then, the first two stanzas are the poetry. and then now you have visitors, readers, the first, and then for what? For occupation, for this. The spreading of my narrow hands to gather paradise. And I'm wondering if the paradise is the full circle of readers reading the writing, reading the poetry. So that's the paradise. It's not so much it's out there, but the paradise is because the reading is nothing, or the writing is nothing unless you have somebody reading, right? I mean, a painting to kept to myself in my closet is one thing, but to have, when I have a painting out and someone says, wow, I that makes me happy, it makes me think of this.
Yeah.
Or if the poetry incites a response, as an artist, I could see the artist saying that is paradise when you have the creative cycle complete.
Right.
So that's a fact.
Right. And that's another really good point as well. Occupation, when she writes for occupation, #this, she's basically pointing back. It's the indicative. She's pointing back to what she's doing as a poet. She's basically saying, this is what I do. This is it. This is my job. I am a poet. She's pointing to the poem by using the word this. She's creating, and creating is the this. Her this was to dwell in possibility. And again, I have to defer back to the professor that led this discussion, where he said that one little word has so much power in it, because it can point to a lot of, like, it makes you kind of, I don't want to give you all those answers. Like, did the hyphens make you pause? Would it have been different if it was a semicolon? Would it have been different if it were a period? Like, does the hyphen do anything for you?
It makes it read differently, yes.
Yes.
It's a longer pause, too. It's a deeper, longer pause.
Yeah.
A harder emphasis, too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Which I found to be really interesting. When I think about writing, when you guys think about writing, and you've obviously done a lot of writing for college, probably more than you ever imagined that you'd be writing. Does it make you think about the concision of this poem and the power and the punch that she packed into this, and the one word, this? Does it make you pause about when you write, when you're writing prose or even poetry, dabbling in poetry? Does it make you consider?
You mean the way Dickinson used it here?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely for me.
Yeah.
I mean, she didn't spell it out for you. She said this hyphen.
Right.
It's like.
And that was very much how she wrote poems. She didn't want to spell things out. Right. Because if you're going to be a part of her little inclusive group of dwelling in possibility, you're gonna dig, and you're gonna eat, and you're gonna partake, and you're gonna be like, I'm digging deeper, I'm chewing on this, and I'm getting this. I'm starting to understand this more on a deeper level, because my imagination is opening up to the possibilities.
Right.
Can I ask you a question on it? Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just agreeing. Go ahead.
Do you think, I know as the older I get, the more I appreciate when I have friends that know me,
Yeah.
I don't have to say a whole lot, and they go, I get you, I know. I wonder if she's saying this, what you just said, you're going to have to dig. I wonder if she's saying she wants the readers to spend time with her, not just with one poem, but just with her work, to say, I know, Emily, I know you. I get what you mean by that, because I've read other things about you and I've gotten to know you.
Yeah.
Like a relationship.
Yeah.
Right. Now I would, that sounds good, but she really did not have a lot of friends.
Yeah.
Right.
She really didn't.
But could she have done it through her writing, though, I guess I'm wondering?
Possibly, but she held her poetry very close to her. She didn't share it.
And these weren't published, you said?
No, they were not published.
Interesting.
There were only 10 poems published out of her 1,800 poems, because I think it was her sister-in-law, she said, you're going to burn every one of my poems when I die. But
Fortunately, her sister-in-law didn't.
I don't really know how many poems were burned, but she did follow through on burning a bunch.
Wow.
But she said that there were only 2 people in her life that were her greatest influences. One was Shakespeare, and the other one was her sister-in-law. And outside of that, she just did not have a huge sphere of influence going on in her life at all, which is very interesting to me. That's another topic of discussion. So in closing, the professor, whose name is Phil Rees, who's the Director Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and English professor at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty director for Kelly Writers House at UPenn, says perfectly, I love this. This poem is intense with its use of verse tools and strategies to reach us, the reader. So anybody else have any thoughts on this poem? What did you think of it? Did you, when you read it, and now, after the discussion, do you look at it differently?
I do, yeah. I appreciate it more too. I think when you first read it, you're like, oh, that's nice. She's creating this metaphor of possibility, and that's cool. And there's a limitless sky, and so possibilities are limitless. Okay, cool. Yep, that's pretty. But then after discussing it and really thinking about it, and then even venturing down the long lane of learning about Emily and who she was as a poet, you just appreciate it a lot more through all of the metaphors and things that she's trying to help you imagine as you read it, almost. Not help you too much, because that's getting back to she wants you to dig for it. She needs you to work for that.
Right.
And earlier you said that it's like almost a level of conceitedness that like she's saying like, come up here, like meet me up here.
Right.
Here's your toll.
Yeah.
But I almost wonder if it's like now after reading it and after the discussion, I'm almost like, wow, I wonder if she was that self-aware. That like she needed to be surrounded by a certain type of person, a certain type of reader, in order to really appreciate her poetry, kind of echoing what you're saying about being known, maybe a little bit. But yeah, all of that I think really encompasses now how I look at it and how I appreciate it.
Right. And going forward, I mean, it's almost like you have a couple more tools to add to your
arsenal.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how does it influence you going forward with reading? Like our discussion about The Old Man and the Sea, and I'm like, what's with this guy fishing all day for 4 days for this fish? And then I read the review or listen to the review, and I'm like, oh boy. But having done this, it really helps me to open my mind more to saying, I can't think in a narrowness. I know who I am. I know where my identity is. But I need to hear from these different perspectives, like the door and the window and so forth. So did you have anything to add?
I think, the first time I read it, I thought, honestly, I don't get it. I don't get it. Oh, well. But, I might have been polite and said, oh, that's nice. But taking the time, I think, reading poetry, I will take time to chew on it again, maybe say it out loud, and consider what else is being said. I think it's fascinating that she didn't write these with publication in mind. I mean, this is like, in all intents and purposes, it's almost like that you just took a page out of her journal.
Right.
This is her writing for herself.
Yeah.
Which to me gives a new, angle on it.
Yeah.
But I would take more time and consider there's a lot more beneath the surface.
Right.
Not hidden. I mean, it might be there. I just need to
turn
my mind off.
You do.
Autopilot.
Right. And this is where we are doing what they call a close reading.
Right.
Yeah.
We're examining every word. Do you have anything to add, Jordan?
Good poem.
Okay.
I like it. It's very, the way that she sets up the contrast between poetry and prose is very visceral for me. That what is poetry? Poetry is possibility, as opposed to, I don't think of prose as impossibility, but rather as definition. Poetry is saying things in an unsaid way. It's here's, you know, the clues, but you're going to have to dig for the conclusion. Whereas prose is, okay, here's premise 1, here's premise 2, here's my conclusion, and that's
Yeah.
my premise 1 for the next
Yeah.
conclusion.
Yeah.
And so it's definition, whereas poetry is this, it's an impossible house. It's gathering paradise in words, that which you can't do it. You can't possibly do it. You could publish 45 volumes of prose and you would never get there. And so instead, to do that, to gather paradise, you have to leave paradise unspoken. And you have to drop breadcrumbs and say, yeah, I dwell in possibility. What is that? Well, she never says possibility is poetry, but comparing it with prose, we come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
I think that it's very, it's a good way. It's given me a paradigm shift now of how I think about poetry versus prose.
That's awesome.
Not just because, oh, this is a good poem, but because the poem itself is about what poetry is.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you guys so much for participating. You've added
welcome.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
to my
This is awesome.
enjoyment of this poem as well.
Yeah,
and,
thanks for reading that. That was
Yeah,
fun.
thank you
Yeah,
for
thank
leading
you.
us.
Yes. Ooh, I can stop sweating now. Okay, now let's hope I don't lose this. Sorry, Nugget, I asked you to move, darling. Okay, that was 46 minutes.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, can you tell
No kidding.
me